My name is Elise Whitlock. I'm 43 now, and at 15, I watched a man drape himself in my father's legacy and sell it to the highest bidder. Just a month after my dad died, no will, no warning, his protege, Dr. Victor Langston, stood on the front page of Medical Vanguard Weekly, beaming under a banner that read, "In honor of Dr. Elias Whitlock." And right there, beneath that stolen smile, were two words that shattered me: co-inventor. But Victor wasn't a partner. He was a thief, welcomed into our home, trusted like blood, who gutted my father's life's work and turned it into a billion-dollar lie. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I waited. And for 28 years, I watched him build his empire on a foundation of betrayal. If you think I disappeared quietly, think again. Before I take you into the storm that followed, hit like, subscribe, and tell me, have you ever seen a thief fall under his own spotlight? Let me take you back to the day it all began. He said he'd finish my father's dream. Instead, he turned it into a billion-dollar nightmare. I didn't find out through a family phone call or a dignified announcement. No. I found out the same way the rest of the world did. On the front page of Medical Vanguard Weekly, in full glossy color, there he was, Dr. Victor Langston, standing beneath a banner that read, "In honor of Dr. Elias Whitlock, pioneer of modern care." And right under that photo, wrapped in quotation marks like it meant something, were the words, "Victor Langston, co-inventor." Co-inventor. The way my jaw clenched, I thought I might shatter my own teeth. Because that word, co, was a lie, dressed in stolen reverence and delivered with the arrogance only a thief could wear so effortlessly. Victor wasn't a partner. He wasn't even an equal. He was a guest in our home, the hungry-eyed protege my father treated like a second son when his own blood had failed him. My father, Dr. Elias Whitlock, built that invention alone, from sleepless nights to sketched circuits on kitchen napkins, from trembling hands soldering wires to the quiet sob of relief when it finally worked. That device was supposed to change the world, not make one man obscenely rich. But when my father died, his heart giving out without warning one gray morning, Victor didn't mourn. He moved. He took the patent, the schematics, every detail in my father's journals, and sold them to the highest bidder, a pharmaceutical giant known more for stock prices than human lives. I was 15, still writing grief poems in the margins of my notebooks. He was already on the board of directors. The device, which my father designed to save lives at low cost, was transformed into a luxury medical miracle, packaged for the rich, withheld from the poor. It was a betrayal so monstrous, it didn't just bury my father, it desecrated him. I remember kneeling at the foot of the altar, fingers wrapped around the last journal he left behind. No inheritance, no will, just pages smudged with graphite and hope. That day, I made a promise no one heard, a silent vow to protect his truth, even if the world called it a fantasy. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I waited, and I watched, for 28 years, but I wasn't finished. I was just getting started. After the funeral, all I had left was a cardboard box, a whispered promise, and a traitor growing fat off the blood and brilliance of my father. Victor didn't just take the patent, he took the story, the narrative, the proof. He walked into boardrooms wearing my father's legacy like a tailored suit, while I stood on the outside, gripping a folder of lab notes and fading blueprints no one would read. He had the paperwork, he had the signature, he had the charm. And in a world ruled by image and ink, that was enough. I tried to speak up. God knows I tried. I contacted reporters, researchers, even former colleagues of my father, anyone who might remember what the truth looked like before Victor repainted it. But the headlines that followed didn't speak of justice or inquiry. They spoke of me, grieving teen spirals after inheritance loss. Heir apparent claims conspiracy in patent dispute. And worst of all, daughter's delusions threaten medical legacy. They didn't call me a liar. That would have required engagement. No, they called me unstable. Cautiously, cleverly, They dredged up my mother's mental health records, twisted them until the ink screamed, and used them to paint me as unfit, as dangerous, as a daughter too fragile to touch her own father's work. My requests to review lab data were denied. My application for access to the original prototype? Rejected on mental grounds. Victor erased me from my father's legacy, the way one might scrub out a typo, clean, fast, final. And then, with a smile for the cameras, he sold it back to me. Or rather, he tried. A limited edition gold-etched replica of the device was released on the 10-year anniversary. I still remember the tagline, "Innovation that runs in the family." I stood in front of the billboard that day until the sun dipped behind it. No one recognized me. No one stopped. I was invisible to the empire my blood had built. And yet, beneath all that silence, something refused to die. Not me, not the truth, not yet. Maybe you think after all that I would give up. But what if I told you that after 28 years, I found something no one else had seen? Don't go anywhere. What's coming next will change everything. 28 years. That's how long I kept my silence. Not because I'd forgiven him, not because I'd forgotten, but because grief has a strange way of quieting even the loudest truths. I told myself the world didn't care, that the past couldn't be fixed, that maybe justice was just another word rich men redefined. But all of that changed the moment I saw his face again, beaming under lights he didn't deserve, at a stage draped in my father's name. A new charity foundation had been launched, not just in my father's memory, but bearing his initials like a brand. The Elias Whitlock Humanitarian Trust. The irony burned so hot I could barely breathe. There he was, Dr. Victor Langston, draped in benevolence, claiming the invention as a collaborative breakthrough, referring to my father not as a mentor, but a colleague who inspired him. That was the moment it clicked. Not the rage, not the loss, but something deeper, something colder. My father wasn't just erased. He was being replaced. And the man who had stolen from him was now laundering that theft through staged philanthropy, whitewashed press releases, and crocodile tears. I watched him place his hand over his heart during a standing ovation. And something inside me broke and rebuilt itself in the same breath. I went home, not to my apartment, but to the place I had locked away in memory like a wound I couldn't touch. My father's old study, sealed for years, still smelled faintly of sawdust and black tea. The dust clung to every shelf, but his journals were exactly where I'd left them, stacked beside his blueprints, some frayed at the edges, others stained with coffee rings and thumbprints. I flipped through them slowly, hands trembling with something I hadn't felt in decades. Not sorrow, resolve. It took me weeks. I read every diagram, every margin note, every crossed-out theory. And then, there it was. A subtle schematic, half erased, buried in a corner page. A secondary port never listed in the official documentation. What looked like a redundancy in design wasn't. It was a backdoor. One only someone with advanced knowledge and deep intimacy with the device could even detect. My father hadn't built it to fail. He built it to speak if someone ever dared to listen. That port, when activated through the right channel, wouldn't just access diagnostic data. It would unlock encrypted telemetry, information Victor never meant to see the light of day. Data on inflated efficacy trials, buried reports of patient deaths, confidential documents showing how he tripled pricing overnight in low-income regions, falsified FDA documents, even records of illegal overseas trials. My father had left more than a legacy. He'd left a landmine, and I had just found the trigger. In that moment, I didn't feel rage. I felt precision. I wasn't confused, I wasn't delusional, and I damn sure wasn't dead. I was loading every piece of evidence into a digital vault. I was contacting the last lawyer who still owed my father a debt of silence. I was sketching a plan so clean, so surgical, it would never trace back to me. I didn't need to confront Victor. I didn't need to shout or claw or demand acknowledgement. I had found the lock, And now, I held the key. You're probably wondering, finding the flaw was one thing. But what could I do with it? Oh, just wait. Because the way I turned his invention into a trap, you're not going to see it coming. I didn't need an army. I just needed a scalpel. Something sharp, quiet, and precise. For 3 months, I worked in silence. Nights bled into mornings in my apartment-turned-laboratory, where solar fumes mingled with the smell of old coffee and determination. I reverse-engineered my father's device. Not to replicate it, but to speak to it. I designed a diagnostic tool, slender, elegant, compatible only with the original architecture, that could tap into the system logs buried deep inside the machines Victor had perfected. What I built didn't scream, it listened. And what it heard made my blood run cold. The prototype worked on the first test. Within seconds, it surfaced hidden logs, overwritten error reports, ghost data from early trials, time-stamped manipulation of firmware. But more than that, it found the missing pieces, the discrepancies in dosage efficacy, the tampered trial results, the fatal side effects scrubbed from public records. I didn't shout. I documented, I encrypted, and I mailed 3 packages with no return address to 3 very specific destinations: a respected independent research group in Geneva, an international pharmaceutical ethics watchdog in Brussels, and an investigative journalist who had once lost her job exposing a cancer drug price-fixing scheme. 3 weeks later, the first ripples hit the surface. A peer-reviewed report published in The Lancet cited unreported adverse outcomes and altered clinical baselines linked to Langston's flagship device. A watchdog alert followed, highlighting 17 fatal complications never disclosed. Victor's empire tried to contain the flames, issuing statements filled with legalese and deflection. But the leak wasn't finished. On the morning of the global gala, where Victor was set to receive the Humanitarian Innovator of the Century Award, an email with no subject line and a single attachment landed in the inboxes of over 200 journalists, editors, and medical regulators. The file? Every extracted log, every buried mortality, every internal memo with falsified signatures. It spoke louder than I ever could. Victor arrived at the venue in his tailored navy suit, shaking hands like a king about to be crowned. But by the time he reached the green room, the murmurs had started. Phones buzzed in pockets. Screens flashed with headlines. Publicists paled. Award coordinators huddled. And Victor? He stood frozen, staring at the email now mirrored across the teleprompter. His own lies dissected line by line. No, I murmured from across the ocean, watching it unfold on my laptop. I don't want justice. I want biblical. If you've ever dreamed of seeing justice delivered in real time, don't blink. The moment of truth didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened under stage lights, and you're about to witness it. The lights were surgical, white, sterile, unforgiving. Victor stood center stage, basking in the artificial glow as the audience rose to their feet in choreographed admiration. Cameras flashed. The MC beamed, and just behind the curtain, a trembling intern clutched a folded slip of paper with shaking hands. She wasn't supposed to deliver it, but protocol didn't matter when truth barged in without knocking. The MC's smile faltered as his eyes scanned the note. His voice wavered, caught somewhere between scripted flattery and the panic clawing at the back of his throat. Then he cleared it, stiffened his jaw, and read aloud, "Due to newly surfaced concerns regarding the integrity of the nominee's body of work, the committee will pause the award ceremony pending immediate review." The applause didn't die. It was strangled. Cut mid-clap. Murmurs erupted like wildfire. Every phone in the room seemed to light up at once. Eyes darted to screens, to one another, to the man on stage now frozen in an unnaturally upright stance. Victor blinked. Once, twice. And then the color drained from his face like ink and water. His lips parted, but no sound came out. He reached for his collar, adjusting a tie that suddenly felt like a noose. The camera didn't cut away. It zoomed in. Tight, merciless. Sweat beaded across his temple. His fingers fumbled at the lapel of his suit, searching for something, balance, control, a lifeline he no longer had. He looked toward the wings of the stage, toward his publicist, who had vanished, toward the audience who no longer applauded, and finally, toward the screen behind him. Now, glowing with a looping headline from a major outlet, "Anonymous leak links Langston devices to unreported fatalities." He staggered back a step, hand brushing against the podium as though it might steady him, might shield him from the weight of 28 years crashing down all at once. But nothing could. He turned, perhaps to flee, perhaps to find a door still open, but the moment he moved, the spotlight followed. The world had waited long enough. And as the whispers turned into pointed glares, and the stage, once his sanctuary, morphed into a courtroom without walls, I watched from afar and whispered, he turned to run, but truth doesn't let you escape. He didn't say a word. He didn't defend. He didn't even deny. He went silent. You might think that was satisfying enough, but trust me, that was only the crack in his empire. What I planted next wasn't just proof. It was poetry. And you'll want to see how it hit him where it hurt most. I never stepped on stage. I didn't need to. My presence was already sewn into every light bulb, every banner, every breath inside that conference hall. While Victor tried to recover from the collapse of his image in front of the cameras, the real strike was waiting just a few steps outside the auditorium. Patient, elegant, and devastating. Beneath the sprawling arches of the exhibition hall, where tech giants and biotech behemoths flaunted their innovations, there sat a modest booth. No flashing lights, no screens, no models in lab coats. Just a pedestal. And on it, the device. Sleek, small, familiar. Except for the name etched into its brushed steel surface, the Whitlock integrity sensor. Beneath it, a single line in clean serif type. True data, true care. And below that, the inscription that silenced everyone who dared to read it, in honor of the man who believed healing should never have a price tag. People gathered, at first out of curiosity, then out of disbelief, and finally with reverence. This wasn't a competitor. This wasn't a protest. This was reclamation. The very core of Victor's empire, the original technology, the promise of integrity, had been reborn, renamed, and publicly stripped from his grasp. It wasn't just the name Whitlock that returned. It was the truth. And this time, it was untouchable. I hadn't just filed the patent under my father's name. I'd licensed it freely for ethical researchers, nonprofits, and open access medical institutions. No profit, no stock options, no hidden clauses. Just science returned to the hands it was meant for. People whispered, some recorded, some wept. But no one missed the irony. While Victor stood under threat of criminal inquiry for hiding death, my father's name now stood in the light. Unbought, unbroken, undeniable. I stood across the street from the convention center, coffee in hand, watching the reporters swirl around the booth like moths to an unexpected flame. No one recognized me, but I didn't care. Because this wasn't about recognition. It was about justice. Subtle, public, irreversible. I didn't need to be on stage. I already owned the lights. Now, you've seen the fall, but what happens after justice is served? Some stories end there. Mine didn't. What came next was healing. And maybe, just maybe, a legacy worth passing on. The house was smaller than I remembered. Not in size, but in sound. After 28 years of noise, of courtroom whispers, sterile hallways, corporate deceit masked in applause, silence felt holy. The old cabin, where my father used to sketch ideas with chalk on butcher paper, was now mine again. And this time, there were no shareholders, no headlines, no traitors. Just me, the soft thud of my boots on the pine floor, and the garden out back that had gone to wild, untamed sleep. The first thing I did was clear the overgrowth around the wooden fence. Vines had crept in where logic once lived, but under the weeds, I found the cornerstones of the herb bed my father had planted. Rosemary, lemon balm, even a hint of thyme. I knelt, dug my hands into the soil, and smiled at the familiar scent of earth warmed by late afternoon sun. Healing didn't start with technology. It started with returning. Every morning, I brewed tea from the garden. Every evening, I lit the old lantern my father had kept on his workbench. The walls were still lined with his notes, yellowing pages pinned above jars of prototypes and broken parts. But now, they weren't relics. They were reminders. This wasn't a laboratory anymore. It was a vow, rebuilt in wood and intention. And slowly, people started to come. The first visitor was a medical student named Clara. She had read about the expose in the journals and traced the name Whitlock not to the headlines, but to the ethics class she attended once a week. She asked if she could just see the place, but ended up staying for tea. Then conversation, then a weekend. After that, others followed, students, young doctors, researchers disillusioned with the system, but hungry for something honest. They came with notebooks, with questions, but most importantly, with silence. Not the sterile kind, the respectful kind, the kind that lets a garden speak. We didn't hold classes. We shared stories. I told them what my father said when no one else was around, that science wasn't about a claim, that if a cure exists but can't reach the dying, it's not a cure, it's cruelty. They wrote those words down like gospel. But I made them promise one thing: never quote him without living it first. Some brought food. One day, a student from Senegal brought a dish her grandmother taught her to make. Another day, a neighbor dropped off sourdough from a local bakery. The house began to smell like community again. On Sunday mornings, we sat under the maple tree my father once planted and brewed chamomile while birds sang above us like they remembered the man who used to whistle back. I wasn't building a company. I was restoring a vow. When I finally launched the Whitlock Integrity Fund, it wasn't announced with a press release. There was no gala, no stage, just a handwritten letter sent to a pediatric clinic in rural Bolivia, offering the first batch of diagnostic devices free of charge. I included a small card. Use it well, use it freely. Healing should never have a price tag. Weeks later, they sent a photo. 3 children smiling next to the machine, one of them holding a hand-drawn thank you note. I framed it, not for ego, for proof that justice, once set in motion, doesn't stop at punishment. It continues in kindness. The day I cleared out the last of Victor Langston's name from the foundation registry, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt still, as if the air itself had let go of a long breath. There was no need for revenge anymore, no urge to be seen. He was being prosecuted. His empire crumbled like dust off the blueprints he once stole. But this garden, these stories, these young minds learning to heal without greed, this was the sentence that mattered. One evening, my niece, Rachel, showed up at the door with a suitcase and red eyes. She had left her residency early, overwhelmed by what medicine had become. She asked if she could stay for a while. I simply said, "Welcome home." That night, I made my father's stew, carrots, barley, and slow-cooked oxtail. And we sat at the same table where he once taught me how to read graphs and peel potatoes in the same breath. Rachel asked me what it felt like to finally win. I looked at her, the firelight dancing on her cheek, and said, "This isn't winning. This is surviving, right?" She didn't need more explanation. She took my hand. We didn't speak again until the pot was empty, and the sky had folded itself into stars. Justice, I learned, isn't a bang. It's a bloom. Quiet, slow, relentless. And somewhere between grief and growth, I became whole again. The world outside kept spinning. But in that cabin, in that soil, in those faces, I finally remembered what peace looked like. And this time, I refused to forget. And just when I had found peace, he was losing everything. If you ever wondered whether karma runs late, let me show you what it looks like when it arrives. Quietly, completely, and without mercy. He once commanded entire boardrooms with nothing more than a raised eyebrow and a well-timed smirk. His words had moved markets, reshaped policies, and made men richer than their conscience could carry. But now, Victor Langston sat alone. No entourage, no tailored entourage of sycophants, no gleam of confidence in his eyes. Just a man in a pressed but wrinkling shirt, hunched slightly forward at a small round table in the corner of an airport cafe, staring at a newspaper he couldn't seem to finish. The headline was cruel in its precision. Fallen visionary or master of deceit. It hovered above his picture, one taken years ago when his empire still glittered like a lie not yet caught. He didn't see me. He was too busy scanning the article, hoping perhaps for a paragraph that might rescue his name from the flood. But there was no such lifeline. Every sentence carried the weight of evidence now confirmed, of silence broken, of illusions undone. Fraudulent efficacy reports, ghost-written clinical trials, offshore shell accounts revealed to be nothing more than money-laundering havens for drug profiteering. The legal tsunami had come not with a bang, but with subpoenas, hearings, and audits that stripped him bare, layer by layer, until only the rot remained. 10 days. That's how long it took for his company's value to plummet by 76%. $9 billion evaporated. His name erased from the foundation's board within hours. His portrait, once framed in marble lobbies and university auditoriums, quietly taken down. At first, he tried to fight, called it a smear campaign, accused jealous competitors, pleaded for due process. But the documents were too thorough, the timestamps too exact, the whistleblowers too many. Truth doesn't bend for ego. His wife, Elena, filed for divorce the following week. No press statement, no dramatic confrontation, just a single couriered envelope delivered to his penthouse and signed with a neat but decisive hand. She didn't want the house. She didn't want the cars. She only wanted her name back. The media coverage turned from scandal to spectacle. Late-night hosts mocked his fall with cruel precision. Think pieces debated whether his empire had ever been ethical to begin with. And yet, the most punishing silence wasn't public. It was digital. His once buzzing social media pages turned to ghosts. No updates, no defenses, no loyal followers left to carry his flame. Even his LinkedIn headline went blank, like he'd deleted his own identity in shame. He became a cautionary tale told in classrooms that used to teach his strategies as gospel. But it wasn't the headlines that haunted him. It was the reflection. I knew it the moment I saw him. He sat facing the window, not for the view, but to avoid seeing his own face in the glossy surface of the black granite countertop. Every now and then, his eyes flicked toward the glass, and then quickly away again, like a child afraid of what they might glimpse in the dark. He looked older, suddenly and irreversibly. Not the refined age of success, but the brittle kind. The sort that comes when guilt is no longer abstract but physical. His hair, once slicked back with vanity, now curled at the edges with neglect. His hands, once celebrated for their precision and poise, shook slightly as he tried to lift his espresso. He spilled a few drops and didn't even flinch. And still, he didn't see me. I stood just past the corner, not hiding, but not intruding either. There was nothing more I needed to say. No confrontation would bring satisfaction greater than this. Watching a man built on mirrors crumble beneath the weight of finally having to look into one. For so long, Victor believed he could outwit consequence, that charisma was stronger than principle, that legacy could be bought and curated. But standing there, in the simplest of places, under the bland yellow light of a coffee counter, I witnessed a truth no courtroom could capture. He was empty, not defiant, not angry, not even desperate, just hollow. His empire had burned from the inside out, not by flame, but by fact. His allies had vanished, his fortune frozen, his influence decayed. Even the whispers in that cafe, low voices glancing in his direction, carried no fear, only pity. And he sat through it all, unmoving, as if he too knew that the world had not just turned against him, it had moved on. The seat across from him remained unclaimed. The phone on the table never rang. Time had divorced him long before his wife did. As I turned to leave, a final glance told me everything I needed to know. He was mouthing the headline to himself. Not the question it posed, but the answer it dared not print. Master of deceit. And for the first time in his life, he didn't deny it. He didn't chase me. He didn't speak. He went silent. After all that fire, you deserve to hear how it ends, not with revenge, but with something more powerful. Let me show you what justice sounds like, when it's whispered instead of shouted. The auditorium was quiet in that rare, sacred way, reserved for moments that mattered. No grand introduction, no swelling music, no polished PR video. Just me, a single woman in a gray turtleneck, stepping up to the lectern in a lecture hall of young, uncertain eyes. Many of them didn't know the full story. Some had heard whispers, but all of them were there for the same reason: to understand why a machine born nearly 3 decades ago still pulsed at the center of a storm. I adjusted the microphone and paused. I could have started with data. I could have unspooled the scandal. But instead, I began with a memory. My father once said, "Medicine must first be kind before it can be brilliant." I let the words settle like dust in sunlight. That's the legacy I reclaim today. A few heads nodded. A few blinked back tears. And just behind them, in the hallway display case, was the device. The original prototype. Polished, restored, but unchanged in function. Nestled beside it, a brass plate with one line engraved in bold serif. Elias Whitlock, healer, not for sale. It now belonged to the public. I had donated it to the Community Science Museum just a few blocks from the free clinic he used to volunteer at. The one where he patched up broken ribs and scraped knees with equal reverence. It sat beneath a spotlight, not as a relic of failure or scandal, but as a monument to principle. Children could press a button and hear his voice, recorded from an old cassette I found in a drawer. You can patent an invention, but compassion? That's shared. I never wanted a stage. I never wanted applause. But somehow, by returning to where the story began, with honesty, with grief, with purpose, I found something greater than vindication. I found voice. After the lecture, a small group of med students lingered. They didn't want to talk about corruption or revenge. They wanted to know about Elias the man, what made him smile, what frustrated him, why he insisted that every chart be handwritten, even when computers were faster. I told them about his tea habits, about how he sang Sinatra while sterilizing his instruments, about the way he'd hold patients' hands even when all he could offer was comfort, not cure. These weren't facts you could Google. These were inheritances, passed hand to heart. And then, like a slow exhale, the noise of the world began to fade. The headlines became archives. The legal battles dissolved into precedent. Victor Langston was no longer a giant. He was a footnote. His name shrank from billboards to cautionary lectures. But my father's name, it grew, quietly, steadily, righteously. Back home, I returned to the old cabin, not as a retreat, but as a root. I rebuilt the garden with my own hands, coaxing lavender and wild rosemary from the soil where he once walked barefoot in spring. The porch swing creaked the same way it always had, and in the mornings, just as the sky yawned open with light, I would carry out a cup of Earl Grey and sit beneath the climbing wisteria. One morning, a letter arrived, handwritten, from a young woman in Mumbai. Her mother had received the device, the updated, safe, and now freely distributed version of it, through a new global initiative I had helped fund. It had caught her cancer before it spread. "She gets to meet her granddaughter because of your father," the letter read, "and because you didn't let his name die beneath theirs." I folded the letter and tucked it inside the same book my father used to read aloud from on Sunday afternoons. Not for record, not for pride, just to keep it close. The foundation we created now bore the name Whitlock Trust for Ethical Medicine. It wasn't a company, It wasn't a legacy project. It was a vow, restored, reborn. We offered diagnostic tools free to clinics in underserved countries. We provided scholarships for students committed to low-income medical service. And on the first page of every welcome packet, we printed the same quote in bold italics. Forgiveness doesn't mean inheritance. Because I never wanted to inherit Victor's wealth. I wanted to inherit my father's truth. And now, I had. There's a power in walking away without shouting. In planting something where ruin once stood. In teaching the next generation that justice is not a flame, it's a seed. I watched the sun rise through the mist that morning, its rays brushing the treetops with reverence. A bird landed on the railing, silent, as if bearing witness. And I sipped my tea, not with vengeance, not with regret, but with the calm that comes when you know you did what was right, even when no one believed you would, even when no one watched. Vengeance was never the goal. Justice was. And justice, when quiet and true, can echo louder than any empire. If this story meant something to you, if it stirred something deep, or made you see justice in a new light, leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that remind us. The truth always finds its voice.